welcome to the Chronicles of Nania, a nanny resource podcast made for nannies by me, a nanny. I'm your host, Martha Reddick, and this week we are going to be talking about how to talk to kids about race. And to do that, I have brought on a very special guest, Dr. Camp. Hello.
Hi. Hello.
How are you?
I'm well. I'm very excited and glad to be here.
I'm excited to do this with you.
Yes,
I had class with Dr. Camp in the spring, and I said in the middle of class, could we record this episode together? But we'll wait until I'm out of class.
Yes, yes.
Until it's summertime, which we've hit now, which is wonderful.
We have.
Chicago weather is maybe catching up to
I think so. I think we're getting there slowly but surely. Yes.
Wonderful. Well, before we get into the interview portion, let's hear a little bit about your background.
Okay, yes. So I am new to Chicago by way of Charlotte, North Carolina. I earned my PhD at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And prior to that, I was a school counselor for 3 years in a high school in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Okay.
Yes. So I am originally from Virginia. I claim Virginia. My father was in the Coast Guard, but we essentially landed in Stafford, which is Northern Virginia. And so that is home to me. So a little bit of movement, but my passion truly is children and youth and school counseling, as well as multicultural counseling. And yeah, so I think no better topic than this one. Right?
Yes,
To really
agreed.
be discussing. It merges many of my passions. So again, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and it merges my passions too. And so I'm really excited to talk about this with you.
Absolutely.
So let's dive in.
Yes, let's.
So why is it important to discuss race and racism with kids?
Yes. So I think given how diverse our world is becoming, right?
Yeah.
We're becoming more black and brown in this world. I think it is important to discuss race and racism because it impacts everyone, right? So regardless of the ethnicity or race of the child with whom you're working, I think that these conversations need to be had. And I would also say it can be learning and hearing about racism may not happen in the home, but it will definitely happen in schools, right? So I think the earlier and the sooner that we can start to have these honest, or what I would like to call critical conversations, the better. And I would also say, of course, it's the family's decision, right? As to whether or not they want to discuss race and racism. Choosing not to discuss it does not negate the reality that, again, race and racism are important, right? And they do impact and influence children in one way or another. So avoiding or limiting these discussions related to race, I think, could lead to children automatically constructing some inaccurate assumptions, maybe some stereotypes that could obviously be potentially harmful or hurtful. So again, it's important to really model and discuss honestly the race and racism with children.
Right. And some families don't have a choice.
Exactly.
About discussing this.
Absolutely.
And some do have the choice.
Absolutely.
And so looking at that of for if you are in a family that has the privilege of not discussing this topic. Looking at why and thinking about that before you decide if you're going to discuss it or not.
Exactly.
And and it does come up. It comes up all the time.
It absolutely does. And children are they're so honest, right? And many of the questions that they ask is not asked with malicious intent. They truly are just naturally inquisitive, right? And so I think even if those families or certain families choose not to openly discuss race and racism, eventually they may need to. Right? An opportunity may present itself, or a circumstance may present itself. And I also want to share a quick story. So I recall maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, being in Gaffney. So my parents are from a small town in South Carolina, Gaffney and Blacksburg. And there's this snow cone place that I absolutely loved. Every summer I would spend the summers with my grandparents, and I would make it a point, right, to beg and go to the snow cone place. So I was by myself, and there was a little boy. If I had to guess, I would say he was maybe 5 or 6.
Mm-hmm.
And he comes in the store, he has $2 or $3 in his hand, and he's super excited. So me being the wonderful person that I am, I allowed him to go in front of me.
Nice.
He then proceeded to look at me, and he looked outside, and he looked at me again, and I just said, "Hi, how are you? What kind of snow cone are you going to get?" And so we had this mini conversation. And then he looks outside again, and he looks at me, and he says, "My grandmother is outside." And I kind of peeked, leaned forward a little bit, and he pointed to his grandmother, who was Caucasian, and she was sitting in her car. And this little boy was visibly biracial, or maybe even multiracial. And so he looks at me, he looks at my arm. Again, this is summer. So he sees my arm is a different color than his, right? So he looks at my arm, he looks at his arm, and then he says, "My brother is your color," right? So he, in that moment, it was obvious that he was processing. He is trying to make sense, right, of his world, or construct meaning based on the ethnicity or color, if you will, of his grandmother. He sees me, he sees his brother, who is of my complexion, and then he's looking at himself. So again, he is trying to fit and make sense of his world and who he is and how he fits into this world. So I think that is just a prime example, again, of how important it is, right, to foster an environment where these conversations can be had.
Yeah. And an example, so in preparing for this interview, I listened to the Life Kit series on NPR, and they have an episode of how to talk to children about race. And I listened to that, and in that, they told this story about students, and a couple different stories actually, about students taking standardized tests, and you have to check a box.
Yes.
And you can only check one box. And so they told stories on this podcast about children who fit more than one box.
Absolutely.
And so even going into a test, not like with that on your brain, and that has nothing to do with your academic ability,
at all.
But it rattles you before you take a test. And so in talking about these issues before they sit down for that test, you can help prevent.
Exactly.
And then also allow children to check off more than one box.
Exactly. And to have a conversation about what that looks like. Hopefully, eventually we'll get to a place where there will be changes or adaptations made so that children and youth don't feel, especially those of racial and multiracial ethnicities, don't feel compelled or forced, if you will, to choose just one. Right? Because that does impact their identity. If they're questioning and looking at me and looking at grandma, right, to my example, it is obvious that they don't fit either one. Right? And so how fair and equitable is that for them if they're unable to really self-identify? Yeah, and what are we getting out of forcing them to check that box? Is it worth their struggle with identity in the 3rd grade, you know? So just that was something that came up for me as I was prepping for this interview, because I tutor, and I tutor a lot of like test taking skills, and I had never even thought about that, of going into the test rattled by which box I will check. Yes, absolutely.
So there are a lot of adults that are uncomfortable discussing race. And kids have such a good sense.
They absolutely do.
For when we are uncomfortable, and it makes them feel uneasy. I mean, obviously it does.
It does.
So how can an adult, a nanny or a parent or any caregiver, learn more and become more comfortable with talking about race and racism in our country, in our world?
That's a great question. And I want to first say I appreciate you acknowledging how children do pick up on those little nuances or just our subtle behaviors. I think children are far more perceptive than we give them credit for, and I think we need to begin doing that. But I would say, to answer your question, to learn more and become even more comfortable about discussing this topic, adults have to first be introspective, right? right? So we have to really reflect and even identify what exactly about race and racism and conversations related to that make us uncomfortable, right? So it could be personal experiences, it could be negative experiences, or maybe even a situation where in families were not openly discussing this topic themselves. And so because of that, they now are uncomfortable having those conversations, which are necessary, but they're uncomfortable having those conversations with their children. So I think first, being introspective would be beneficial. And then secondly, I would say exposing oneself to other cultures, right? So even here in Chicago, it is very diverse. The city is rich in culture. And so for families who are here in Chicago or surrounding areas, it's helpful to venture outside of your comfort zone.
Right.
It's intimidating. It, of course, is uncomfortable, but it goes a long way. And then you doing so and exposing your children to experiences outside of what you're naturally used to, that can really teach them to see and allow them to see individuals in other realms of habitation, right? And their more level of comfort. So I think there are various ways adults can do that. So attending multicultural events in the community, trying different ethnic restaurants, which here in Chicago there are so many of them, right? And of course visiting many of the museums that are also here. So again, just venturing outside of what we are accustomed to or used to and comfortable in, and just expanding the knowledge of racial differences.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also would add your library as a resource.
Absolutely, yes.
So if you are living in a place that isn't as accessible to other cultures as Chicago is, your library is a great resource. And librarians, I have found that some people are scared of librarians, and I would encourage you to not be, because they're wonderful.
They're awesome. They
love helping.
They absolutely do.
And so if you went to your librarian and asked, you know, I'm want to learn more. Absolutely. What books can I read? Yes. They'll help you find it. And then also, when you're on vacation, if you are in a place that is not as culturally diverse, seek out the culture of the place that you're going. But then also, if you're coming to some place like Chicago, you know, the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry is wonderful, but there's also the Museum of Mexican Art.
Exactly.
And, you know, there's so many different, so think about that when you're going on vacation.
I agree.
To use
I
those.
absolutely agree. And I think when going on vacation, for those families who are fortunate enough to do so, it is easy to go and stay, even out, you know, on vacation, to stay within what you're most comfortable with.
Right.
So it is important to, again, push yourself and venture out to the more culturally diverse areas of wherever it is that they're vacationing.
Right. Exactly. Because you're already outside of your comfort zone.
Exactly. Why not? Yes. Why not? Venture out.
Okay. So I do think that before you have conversations with children, it is important to do that introspection.
Absolutely.
So I encourage anyone listening to start that journey for yourself.
Yes.
And it is a journey. There's no finish line.
Absolutely. I was about to say this is a lifelong journey, right? Very fluid. So, and patience, being patient with yourself in the process.
Yes.
Right? That is huge and very important, to just be patient, but to sit in it and say, okay, why does this make me uncomfortable? Right? My child has come to me and asked me X, Y, or Z. Why is this coming up? For what is it that is coming up for me? And just sit in it. It's uncomfortable, but to acknowledge that and then work through and process that will allow you to have more of those critical conversations, as I alluded to earlier.
Yes. So then once you've done that, how can you translate that to be able to talk with kids about it? Because they're, you know, developmentally at different places.
Absolutely, yes.
Depending on their age.
Exactly. And so I actually would say that. So depending on the age of the child, that would determine the approach, or the approach that is maybe best So I would elaborate and say, in addition to going to a library and finding out books that represent cultural diversity, even educational videos, right? So they're children who learn in different ways. So there may be more of the tangible visuals via book, but also educational videos. I think that would be helpful. And of course, also engaging children in events, again, that are inclusive.
Right.
Right? So they can see it in a book, but they can also experience it firsthand in person.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that is beneficial also. And I think, too, including toys. So, right, toys. I'm a play therapist, I would like to say, by training. And we always say that toys are children's words and play is their language.
Yeah.
Right? So if we can give them words via toys that represent diversity, that would also be helpful. Right? So you could have different sizes in terms of animals. You can have different shades of a doll family. All of those things can help to facilitate conversations and generate questions from the children.
Right.
In terms of differences. So I think that's another way to translate all of that is in a way that is appropriate for children.
Yes. And just there's an episode of Chronicles of Narnia that if you haven't heard it yet and you're intrigued by this episode, I would suggest, which is The Power of Play.
Yes. Yes.
And so and that looks at what children are hearing in the news and how it will affect and come out in their play.
Absolutely.
So we're not necessarily going to go down that tangent, though I would love to with you, Dr. Camp, but and someday I hope to have that conversation.
Absolutely, we
but
can.
If you are listening and you're like, oh, that I like that concept, I want to know more, The Power of Play is a great episode to listen to.
That's wonderful.
So is it better for an adult to initiate this conversation, or is it better for the adult to wait until the child starts asking?
That's a great question. So it could go either way, right? So it could definitely go either way. I will say, though, that research has shown that children start to notice differences in skin color or skin tone as early as 6 months.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
So I think knowing that alone, for me personally, I think the sooner conversations can take place regarding race, the better.
Right.
Simply because, again, as early as 6 months, children start to really recognize those differences. So I think depending on the age of the child, again, questions will arise. So it's important that the adult be comfortable and ready to respond to these questions. So again, fostering a space in an overall relationship wherein children feel comfortable coming to you, right? And asking questions is important. And I think if their efforts to initiate these conversations or to ask these questions and be just the naturally inquisitive beings that they are, then they will likely stop asking. Right? They will feel like, okay, maybe my questions related to this are bad.
Right.
They shouldn't be asked. And with that, they can internalize a lot of those things, right? And feel, again, as if questions related to race are bad, when indeed they should be asked. Because, again, our world is changing. So I think it's important to have these candid conversations, and the sooner, the better.
Right, right. And also, yeah, I think just getting the ball rolling with different types of toys, and when you are checking books out of the library, looking for diversity in in the stories that you all are sharing together. I come from a theater background. I'm a huge believer in the power of storytelling and how impactful that can be. Absolutely. And so finding ways to get out in front of stereotypes princesses don't have to look like Disney, like the original Disney.
Exactly.
They're doing slightly better now, but
thankfully, right?
Thankfully.
Yes.
But yeah, just being mindful as you're bringing stories and toys and news and what you're consuming into your home, because they pay attention.
They absolutely do. And I think down to even what magazines or what have you, right? If there are magazines in the home, are they diverse?
Right.
Do they represent different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, or is it all just one race that these children are seeing? and just simply providing all of those things that you just mentioned, that opens the door for conversations. It says, okay, this is a safe space, right? This is a safe space to ask questions that are important to be asked.
Right. So sometimes when kids are asking questions and they have no filter,
none,
and they can say some things that are potentially hurtful because they don't know the history and the weight of what they are asking.
Yes.
So how can we teach our children that we are taking care of to be respectfully curious?
I like that, respectfully curious. I, again, believe I mentioned earlier in our conversation that children are just naturally inquisitive, right? So while they often have no filter in asking the questions that they ask and saying the things that they say, we may perceive it to be hurtful, while from the child, it's not meant or intended to be malicious.
Right.
Right? They ask just on a whim. But there's sincerity in that question. So I think truly as adults, I think sometimes we allow our own stuff to get in the way. Right? So when a child asks a question, for us, because we're uncomfortable, we may get offended or assume that someone else may get offended. Right? So I think our own stuff leads to overreactions and misinterpretations.
Yes.
Right? So that, again, when I mentioned earlier that moment of being introspective and sitting in that discomfort, I think that can help to eliminate some of the overreactions and misinterpretations that we have. Right? When children ask questions. But I too think that should the child ask a question that is insensitive, those moments are teachable moments. Right? So helping a child or allowing a child to become more aware of positive words versus negative words, right? Or a positive way to ask a question versus a negative way to ask a question. And again, just simply having a conversation. What made you ask that question? Right? Yeah. Where did you see this? Where did you see that? Where did you hear this? Where did you hear that? And then just having that honest conversation, I think that can help foster more of a respectful curiosity, if you will. Right?
Yes. And I want to note that when you were asking those questions, your voice was light and open.
Absolutely, yes.
And so I think when we're talking about these things, really paying attention to our own tone.
Yes, that is true.
Because there's a big difference between where did you hear that and where did you hear that?
Exactly.
And so, and kids pick up on those tiny differences. And I know sometimes when we are feeling uncomfortable and our own brains are kind of flared up, that we don't have space to pay attention for that.
That is true.
So I would encourage you, as a nanny, which we do on a lot of episodes, to take, if you are feeling overwhelmed and flooded, to take a moment and say to the child, you know what, I would love to talk to you about this, but I need a second to think. Or I've talked a lot about how the kids that I nanny love to ask questions when I'm driving, and when I'm driving with children in the backseat in Chicago,
I'm
so focused.
As you should be.
And so one of my strategies is you can ask 3 questions the entire car ride, because when we're going down to like museum campus or something like that, there's a lot of traffic.
Absolutely.
And so that's one of my strategies. And then another is, I would love to answer this, but I want to be able to do it when I can give you my full attention.
That's wonderful. Yes.
And so I think just knowing that you don't have to answer it right in that second.
I love that. That is so true.
Whether it be that you're in the middle of an activity that you can't give it your undivided attention, or that you are feeling overwhelmed and want a chance to think about it.
Exactly. And that is completely okay. I completely agree with that. I think that's a great approach.
Yeah. And also sometimes because we are nannies and we are working for families and working with a family's culture, we also want to check in with the parents, because you don't know.
That is true. What conversations are taking place. That is true. That is true. And respecting those boundaries is extremely important.
It really is.
Yes.
And so just also, I would encourage you to potentially pause and
Mm-hmm.
talk to the parents if you're unsure rather than blazing forward.
Absolutely, I agree. That's a good suggestion. Great suggestion.
Yeah. So, and we talked about taking that pause, but what if a kid asks you a question that you don't know the answer to?
Oh, tricky. Because you know what? That will happen.
Right.
And I have just come to learn that honesty is more important than anything else, in my opinion, especially when working with children and just establishing and maintaining that trust with them. So if you are asked a question that you don't know the answer to, I would suggest just being honest.
Right.
And saying that very thing. You know what? That is a great question. That is a great question. And Miss Amy doesn't know the answer to that. Right? And just owning that. Just accepting the fact that I don't know. Right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to conjure up this lie or fabricate something and tell the child. So I think it's absolutely okay to just say, that's a great question, and I actually don't know the answer. And then I would take it a step further and say, I can either find out and let you know, or we can find out the answer together.
Yes.
Right? And make that a joint effort and opportunity to learn something together.
Right.
Right? I think as adults, it's hard for us to accept the fact that we don't know everything.
Right.
Right, truly. It can be a challenge for us to own up to something that we do not know. But for children, it's important to just state that and say, I do not know. And you can learn together and explore together. I just think that's important.
Yeah, and modeling how to learn something.
Absolutely, yes.
I mentioned I tutor children, and a lot of what I do is teaching them how to read an article and learn from it.
Yes.
And I do that through modeling of when I looked at the title, this is what I thought the article, predicting, and things like that. And so talking through the learning process is so important.
It is extremely important. And I think for a child, too, for you to just own it and be honest and say, I don't know. Later on down the road, they can do the same thing.
Right.
And there's no guilt or shame behind not knowing everything.
Right.
So it is all just teachable, so many teachable moments.
Yeah, and I also think that it's important that if you do think that you know,
right,
and then you find out that you were incorrect about even a slight part of it.
It could be small. Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
To go back and say, you know what? I thought that this was true, and it's not.
Exactly.
And I was looking it up because you asked me.
Exactly.
And I learned this. There's a story. My mom was a second grade teacher, and she was reading Sleepy Hollow to her kids, and in it they talk about the Hessians, and one of the boys in her class was like, yes, those were German soldiers that came over. And my mom was like, I think it was anyone from Europe. And he was like, no, it was the German soldiers. And she came home and looked it up,
researched,
and went back in and was like, you know what? I was wrong. And you were right.
Yes.
So thank you for that.
Yes.
And modeling that.
Absolutely. It goes a long way. And life is fine.
Right.
Life is fine.
My mom did not lose any clout in her classroom because
she's still effective and still molding and shaping the lives of our future. But I just think that is so important. And again, we as adults can get in our own way.
Yeah.
Right? So again, just being honest and owning, I'm not sure, I can find out. That goes a long way.
Right. So we've talked a lot about talking.
Yes.
But kids are much more influenced by our actions than our words. So what are some ways that adults can model being more inclusive? Yes.
So the first thing that comes to mind to me or for me is that notion of practicing what you preach. Right? So often we say things, but do our actions truly align with what we're saying? So I think if you are encouraging and discussing inclusivity in the home, really reflecting on whether your actions actually model that. So I would say ways in which an adult or even a nanny can model these behaviors would just be to think about the ways in which they're interacting with and responding to others, especially individuals who look different from
right.
them. So I would say places that they frequent and social interactions or social circles even that they maintain is important. So for example, if a child attends a school that maybe is not diverse, so the only other teachers and peers that they're seeing look like them, considering involving or engaging those children in activities outside of school, beyond school, that is inclusive of others or represents diversity in a greater way. So I would say even in the neighborhood, religious or spiritual events, and community events, right? So really, again, just exposing them to individuals that look different from them. I would also say that subtle messages go a long way as well, right? So nonverbal communication, but just a simple action or behavior. So given all that is happening in our society, within the news and the media, I think parents' responses to that and conversations surrounding those topics can also be impressionable for children, right? So just the simple way in which we respond, again, goes an extremely long way. And something as simple as being in the grocery store or walking down the street, do you cross the street when you are approaching someone that looks different from you? Right? That is a very subtle yet powerful message that you're conveying to a child. So again, just being mindful of those minor yet powerful nuances in the way in which you behave goes a long way.
Right. And also I think playground culture
absolutely
is such a rich place to look at this.
Yes, it is. That is true.
So how are you responding to other nannies if somebody drops something, picking it up and talking and starting that interaction, or if both kids are playing, because I'm working with pre-verbal kids right now, so they're toddlers. So, but
that's fun.
So that means that I'm interacting with other nannies more often because I'm speaking on behalf of the children that I'm in charge of, and so just thinking about how you're talking to other humans and other kids and all of that. And the playground, I think, is really one of the best places.
It absolutely is. I have to agree with you on that. And even though you're working with pre-verbal children or toddlers, children are so wise. I can't say that enough. And so even though they may not have the language to articulate what they're thinking, how they're feeling, or what they're seeing, they think, they see, and they feel.
Yes.
Right? And so I'm glad to know that you're self-aware of the way in which you're interacting with others, because they notice, they pick up on those subtle messages.
They really do.
Yes.
So for school-age children, they talk to other kids. That's part of being a school-age child. And sometimes they can get information that's wrong or hurtful, or those hurtful words can be flung with or without understanding the maliciousness behind them. So how can we help kids who may be dealing with racism and or bullying at school?
That's a good question.
It's a big question.
It's a big question, somewhat loaded even. It's just one question, but there's so much there. So unfortunately, bullying and even racism is more overt now, right? There's some significant impacts behind both of those. And so I think this really all goes back to the question earlier about the importance of discussing race and racism, right? And so for me, I think earlier exposure to and conversations about ethnic and racial diversity is extremely important, or even critical, I'll say. And so I think as those conversations are taking place, adults should really encourage children to ask questions, right? Provide a safe space, but encourage children to ask questions, because that can help to foster a level of comfort. Right. And then beyond that, I think it can help to foster a level of self-esteem and self-confidence, not only within self, but also in looking at and interacting with children who look different from themselves. Right. And I think even in you asking that question, it makes me think about my personal experience growing up. And my father was in the Coast Guard. I personally lived the majority of my life in Stafford. So when we first moved there, it was not as diverse as it is now. So a lot of military families have begun to move there now, but in the majority of my upbringing and in class, in school, I was one of very few, like a handful of minority children, right? And so I think for me, my parents really, through conversation, through books, really, as early as I can remember, there were books with little brown girls, there were books with other ethnicities, there were baby dolls, primarily brown girls. So that, for me, helped, again, foster this level of self-confidence and self-esteem in who I am. Right? And so while I'm in a class, if not the only, African-American child, I was one of a handful of other minorities. But that was okay. Right? Because I knew who I was. I was able to ask questions. There were comments, of course, that were made that made me a little confused or think and question, right? But I would take that home because the environment was such that I was able to, and that I was encouraged to come home and ask questions, right? And I think that, again, is extremely important. And beyond that, my parents put me or engaged me in extracurricular activities where there was diversity, right? There was diversity. My birthday parties, there was diversity. So they ensured that there was diversity around me. And I think that, again, is very important that we do that. And so ultimately, these conversations, I think, can help counteract, hopefully, the impact of racism and bullying. Because the openness is there, the encouragement is there. Hopefully the self-esteem, self-confidence is being fostered through exposure to differences. We're all different in some way, right? Or another. And so I think to not only acknowledge that, but accept that and celebrate differences can help, again, just counteract some of those effects of the racism and bullying.
Yes. And I think kids have a strong sense of fairness. That's very, very important to them.
Absolutely.
So when talking about this and breaking it down for them, using that to your advantage, that they already have this sense of what is fair and what is not fair, and saying, this is not fair.
Exactly. And being honest. That honesty component. Absolutely.
And I also think that the conflict resolution episode that we've done is a good one to re-listen to if this is something that's in your world right now, which it's in all of our worlds right now, really. So talking through how to resolve conflict can also help get out in front of some of these things.
I agree. And I think, too, even helping children acknowledge who additional resources or support systems, I'll say, who additional resources or, support systems are, is also important, right? So they have you, they have hopefully their families, but beyond that or outside of that, who else in the school or who else in the community do they have the support of? And allowing them to acknowledge that, I think, it's so much, and my heart just kind of aches for children these days because there's a lot that they really do have to work through, process, deal with, cope with, manage. It's just a lot. So the support definitely comes into play or is beneficial.
So kind of a blessing of having a nanny in your family is that nannies are sometimes different races or cultures than the family that they're nannying for. So how can a nanny talk about those differences with their nanny kids?
That's good. First and foremost, just being honest, right? Just being honest. And I think for many children and families, the nanny may be, especially if they're of a different race, that may be the first exposure or firsthand experience that a child has had with someone who looks different from them. Right. And I think that's great that there's so many teachable moments even within that. So I think that discussing race is important. So again, reading books, visiting the local library, watching educational videos, playing with the child or allowing them to play, and entering into that world, and even facilitating crafts. So I think crafts that represent cultural diversity, it may require some research, right, on the nanny's end, but I think even integrating hands-on crafts and things would be helpful.
Yes, I completely agree. So if a nanny experiences racism while on duty, what can the nanny family do to help with that? I can't imagine how hurtful and hard that would be.
Absolutely. I think it's important for the nanny to disclose that information and really just share their experience.
Yeah.
Right? To share that with the family, to have that open, honest conversation. And I also think that while there are many individuals who are self-aware of their biases and their prejudices, there are others who truly are unaware.
Right.
They don't have that level of self-awareness. No one has, or maybe a certain experience has not allowed them to confront those prejudices and those biases. So I think a nanny should definitely disclose what their experience was, whether it be in the home or even outside of, right? While on duty, outside of. So just having those conversations. But I will say it is important to speak up and to have that conversation, because if not, a nanny could personalize that experience, right? And then that can begin to interfere or affect their ability to fulfill their duties and perform their job, right? And so I think it's important, again, just to have a candid conversation.
Yeah. And as you were saying that, I was also thinking, if you don't disclose, the kids will probably say something, and it might be more complicated.
Yes.
The parents might not be able to piece together what
is said exactly.
Yeah, really happened or anything like that. So I think being open about it is one of the best ways to make sure that confusion and miscommunications don't happen around this.
And what a powerful moment. So though uncomfortable and unfortunate, it can, again, be a powerful and teachable moment for the family.
Yeah. And then what about if a nanny is taking care of kids that experience racism while the nanny is on duty?
Yes. So again, this all goes back to conversation. So I think it would be helpful to ask the child, what happened? Right? What happened? How did that make you feel? I think as adults, it is important for children to be able to articulate their feelings.
Right.
That is not something that they should be shunned away from doing. They should absolutely know how they feel and what that does to them and what that means. So I think helping process with them through that experience is helpful. It just all goes back to communication.
Yeah. And I think that the reflective listening that we've talked about a lot on the podcast is really good tool for that moment of,
absolutely.
I hear that you felt really hurt by that and things like that, so that you're not putting your stuff
in it
on in it or on it.
That's very good.
I think that's really important.
That's good.
So if a nanny is listening, or a family is listening to this and wants to know more, we've mentioned some resources, but what are some resources that they can learn more?
So the primary resource, I would say, or at least a good start, would definitely be, as we've mentioned, I think throughout this entire podcast, would be the library.
Yes.
Right? It's summertime. The children are out of school.
Yeah.
So what better place to really start? Because even within that resource, you can find out about other opportunities within the community. Right. So perhaps the library not only has books and educational videos, but also activities, hands-on crafts, and things of that nature. So I would suggest starting there, and also a general search in terms of texts, right? Textbooks or books that really address this really address racism.
Right.
Right? Prejudices, biases, and then professional development.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are lifelong learners and we are forever learning about ourselves as we grow and mature, I think it's important just to really tap into professional development opportunities.
Yes.
And trainings and things of that nature.
Yes, which International Nanny Training Day,
Mm-hmm.
If your International Nanny Training Days have not had diversity
Mm-hmm.
in the past, I think this is a really great call to action to work on changing that.
Yes.
And or Nanny Palooza is a wonderful resource.
Sounds
and
like it.
Yeah, and the International Nanny Association
Mm-hmm.
all offer really good professional development. So if you're hearing that and you're like, but wait,
Mm-hmm.
where do nannies have professional development? There are a lot of places
Yes.
that we can go that are geared specifically towards nannies. And then also there's all those parenting
Yes.
resources. So as nannies, we can always kind of dig into those as well.
Absolutely.
And I would encourage anyone who's listened to this to also listen to NPR's Life Kit, How to Talk to Kids About Race.
I love that.
They
yes.
talk about some different things than we've discussed here. And it's another great resource.
And I'll have to listen to that as well. I have not heard that yet.
Yeah, it's a good one. And they have how to talk to kids about a lot of different things,
Yes.
which is great because these things they can feel overwhelming and tricky.
They can. But I think, again, communication, the introspective piece that we discussed earlier, so just knowing yourself and why this topic may ruffle some feathers or make you feel uncomfortable and really just processing through that. But our world is changing and we should be able to change with it and become more inclusive and open to diversity.
Yeah. And I think even during your off hours, how you explore the world around you makes a big difference. So if you find yourself consistently surrounded by people that look like you, ask yourself why. And I challenge and encourage you to change that if that is something that you find. To seek out opportunities to learn.
Absolutely.
Because as nannies, that's I think a lot of nannies, the majority of nannies, are curious by nature as well, because that's what we foster
yes, I love
in
that.
children. So use that.
Yes. And I will say too, and you don't have to do it by yourself.
Yes.
Right? You don't have to, this is a journey that you don't have to approach alone. So bring another friend, take another friend with you, go visit a museum that you haven't been to, or go walk around a neighborhood that you haven't ventured out to just yet, right? You don't have to go it alone.
Right. Yeah, get your nanny squad.
Yes.
I love it. Well, is there anything else?
I do want to share something.
Yes.
In my play therapy training at UNCC, I worked with this little boy. How old was he? 6, I believe, at the time. And I remember during one of our play sessions, he was playing, and he just randomly said, do you like me? And I responded and I said, oh, you're wondering if I like you. I said, you really enjoy your special time here with me, right? And so he continued to play. And then he said, he looked at me, and this was a Hispanic little boy. And he looked at me and he said, I have a friend at school who has brown skin like you. You have brown skin. He said, now I have 2 friends with brown skin. And that just warmed my heart. So again, just another example of the processing.
Yeah.
So if it starts as early as 6 months, children at 6 years old, right, are definitely, again, trying to make sense of their world.
Right. Yeah.
And for our ending story, I also have a story that is a child trying to figure out how they fit in their world. And I recorded this about 1.5 years ago at Nanny Palooza. Patsy and Dal sat down with me and told me this story, and I saved it and waited until I had the perfect episode, and I really think this is it. So here is the story.
So I worked with a family many years ago, and the youngest boy and I, we were kind of close. And one day he said to me, Patsy, can I lick you? I'm like, why do you want to lick me? And he says, I think you taste like chocolate. And I said, can I lick you? And he says, why do you want to lick me? I said, because I think you taste like vanilla. So he licked me, and he said, you don't taste like chocolate. And I licked him, and I said, you don't taste like vanilla. I said, now lick yourself. And he said, we taste the same.
Oh my goodness. What a beautiful, beautiful moment.
And it just warmed my heart, but then when Mom came home, and he said, Mom, Patsy doesn't taste like chocolate, she tastes just like me. and he was so excited, and I was so excited for him, and Mom just totally took it the wrong way.
Right.
She became very apologetic, and she goes, don't say things like that. That's not right for you to say things like that. And Patsy, I'm so sorry. I'm like, no, it's okay. It's okay. To me, that was like a teaching moment for him, and also for me too.
Yes.
Because I didn't really grasp why he wanted to lick me. I couldn't understand it, but I guess that was his way of noticing that I was different from him. Mm-hmm. And in the licking, realizing that we were basically the same.
And what a beautiful moment that could have gone in a completely different direction.
Exactly.
And I applaud you for not just saying no.
He was 3 years old, and for a 3-year-old to want to lick me, it just made me curious, because they'll want to put everything else in their mouth but
right.
Yeah. So, and I realized that in the household that wasn't really spoken about, and I was aware of it. So it was just really interesting in the way he brought it out. He introduced it. I never said anything about color or anything like that, but he noticed it, and it was just in his little way of trying to understand it.
Yeah.
And it was a wonderful moment, which I will never forget.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, that's so beautiful. I love that. Thank you so much, Patsy.
You're more than welcome.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. This has been fun. I look forward to our next podcast.
Me too. I love
Thank
this.
you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Camp. And thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Chronicles of Nania is partnered with Via the Village. Via the Village has created a platform for families and nannies to come together to build your own personalized villages within your local community. Families can find other families near them for childcare exchanges, kiddie carpools, play dates, or new neighborhood friendships. Nannies can find other nannies near them for play date meetups and also for backup when they need time off. And you can also find more support through Via the Village's shared blog and community forum. Check it out at viathevillage.com. VIATHEVILLAGE.com. Check it out. Chronicles of Nania is produced and hosted by Martha Reddick. Artwork by Noni Amadan. Theme music by Brad Kemp. Find him at secondbedroomstudio.com. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Chronicles of Nania and on Twitter at Nania Podcast. To contact us, email chroniclesofnania@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.
This show has been brought to you by Machine Culture.